The lie that shook the courtroom. You really thought you could get away with this, Officer Reynolds, but the truth always comes out. What happens when a sworn testimony begins to crumble under the weight of the truth? A police officer stands before the court, testifying that a woman resisted arrest and attacked him. His words are confident. His story seems airtight. Until she steps forward. Until she speaks. And with just a few words, the entire courtroom is shaken to its core. Who is she? And why does her testimony leave not just the officer, but the jury and even the judge completely speechless? This isn't just a case. This is the story of how one lie unraveled, and how the fight for justice became a fight for the truth. The trial begins. The early morning sunlight slipped through the heavy courtroom drapes, casting long shadows on the polished wooden floor. The room, though grand in design, felt stifling, almost suffocating. Rows of wooden benches were packed with spectators, reporters jotting down notes, curious locals leaning forward in anticipation, and a few faces etched with quiet tension. At the defendant's table, Elena Walker sat with an unsettling calm, no fidgeting, no nervous glances. Her deep brown skin gleamed under the artificial lights, and her jet-black hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail. The overhead lamps reflected off the small insignia pinned to her blazer collar. She didn't look like someone accused of assaulting a police officer. She looked like someone ready for battle. The trial begins. Elena Walker sat upright, her back perfectly straight, as if pulled by an invisible string. Her hands rested lightly in front of her, fingers loosely clasped together. She was dressed modestly, a crisp white blouse tucked neatly into black slacks. A deliberate choice. It spoke of humility and respect, yet something in her sharp, assessing gaze suggested she was far more than she appeared. To the casual observer, she was just another defendant. But to those who looked closer, there was something off, a quiet intensity, a presence that didn't fit the profile of someone accused of a violent crime. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. All rise. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Judge Leonard Whitaker strode in. An older white man with thinning silver hair, he carried himself with the weight of experience, though his weary expression hinted at years of presiding over cases he'd rather forget. This one, however, seemed different. Maybe it was the presence of Officer Daniel Reynolds, sitting smugly at the prosecution's table, or perhaps it was the fact that this case had already made headlines, drawing both curiosity and controversy. State versus Elena Walker, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing against the high ceilings. Elena rose, smoothly, deliberately. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd as heads turned to get a better look at her. Across the room, Officer Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his mouth curling into a self-assured smirk. His police uniform was neatly pressed, his posture exuding the kind of arrogance that came from years of unchecked authority. At the defense table, Nathan Cole, a young black attorney fresh out of law school, shuffled nervously through his notes. He was good but green, and he knew it. He stole a glance at Elena, searching for some kind of reassurance, but she didn't return the look. She remained locked onto the judge, her expression unreadable. Cole exhaled sharply and pushed himself to his feet. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but just shy of confidence, "the defense is ready to proceed. The testimony begins." Judge Whitaker nodded, his gaze shifting toward the prosecution's table. "Officer Reynolds, you may take the stand." The officer rose slowly, every movement exaggerated, as if he were performing for an unseen audience. He adjusted his uniform with practiced precision, then strode toward the witness stand, pausing just long enough to glance at Elena Walker. His smirk was faint but unmistakable. A predator sure of his prey. As he took the oath, Elena studied him. She noted the way his fingers fidgeted slightly, the barely perceptible shift in his posture as he sat down. These were details most people would overlook, but she cataloged them with the precision of someone trained to read body language. She didn't flinch, didn't move. Reynolds cleared his throat and began to speak. "On the evening in question," he said, his voice steady, loud enough to carry across the room, "I was responding to a disturbance call near the west side of town. I encountered the defendant, Miss Walker, loitering outside a closed business." A few murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Loitering, a word often used as a catch-all accusationist, actually against people of color. Reynolds pressed on, seemingly unfazed. "When I approached her and asked what she was doing there, she immediately became hostile," he continued, his tone taking on a theatrical quality. "She refused to identify herself, raised her voice, and when I attempted to de-escalate the situation, she physically assaulted me. Gasps echoed across the room. Elena remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Reynolds shifted in his seat, feigning discomfort as he placed a hand on his chest. She struck me here and attempted to grab my service weapon. At that point, I had no choice but to restrain her. The tension in the room thickened. The jury exchanged uneasy glances, but Elena, she didn't react. She just sat there, watching, waiting, because she knew something Officer Reynolds didn't. The moment of truth. From the back of the courtroom, a woman's voice muttered, "Sounds like a lie." Heads turned. The murmur spread for a brief second before Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel. Order in the court. His tone was sharp, allowing no room for debate. At the witness stand, Officer Reynolds held his composure, though his smirk faltered ever so slightly. "Thank you, Officer Reynolds," Judge Whitaker said, his voice neutral. "You may step down." Reynolds rose from his seat, his movements confident. Too confident. At the defense table, Nathan Cole stood, his nerves evident in the way he adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to ask the court to consider." "Save it for your cross-examination, Mr. Cole," the judge interrupted. "Let's move on." Elena Walker exhaled softly, controlling the irritation bubbling beneath the surface. Her patience was being tested, but she refused to let it show. She leaned slightly toward Cole and whispered, "Stay calm. Focus on the facts." He gave a small nod, though his grip on the table betrayed his unease. As the prosecution rested its case, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Reynolds returned to his seat, his smirk now a full grin. He exchanged a knowing glance with the officers seated in the back row. Elena didn't miss the wink he gave them. "Miss Walker," the judge said, his tone carrying an edge of skepticism, "it's your turn to testify." Elena rose, smoothing her blouse before making her way to the witness stand. The room fell into a thick silence. Hundreds of eyes were on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down. She adjusted the microphone with slow, deliberate movements, letting the tension linger for just a moment longer. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and a sharper tongue, leaned forward slightly. "Miss Walker," he said, his tone clipped, "can you explain your actions on the night in question?" Elena held his gaze, then turned toward the jury. Her voice was steady, measured. "I can," she said, "but first, I need to clarify one thing." She let her eyes sweep over the jury, making sure each of them was paying attention. "The officer's account is not only inaccurate," she paused, letting the tension build, "but intentionally misleading." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the room. The weight of the moment settled in. Elena was no ordinary defendant. And this was no ordinary case. The truth begins to unravel. The prosecutor smirked, leaning back slightly in his chair. "Bold accusation, Miss Walker. Do you have any proof to back it up?" Elena met his gaze, her dark eyes unyielding. "I believe the truth will come to light soon enough. The truth will speak." The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond, but her calm, unwavering confidence left him momentarily speechless. She let the silence stretch before continuing. "That's when Officer Reynolds approached me." The prosecutor leaned forward, sensing an opening. "And you're saying this encounter was completely unprovoked?" Elena tilted her head slightly, her expression unwavering. "Not entirely. I was standing on the sidewalk, which, as far as I know, isn't illegal. He approached me with his flashlight pointed directly at my face and asked, in a tone I wouldn't call friendly, what I was doing there." The prosecutor's tone turned skeptical. "And how did you respond?" Elena's voice remained steady, unshaken. "He tightened his grip," she said, her tone calm yet deliberate. "He said, and I quote, 'Women like you need to learn how to listen.'" Gasps erupted from the gallery. Judge Whitaker's gavel came down hard. "Order, I will not tolerate interruptions." The prosecutor forced a tight smile, working to regain control of the moment. "Miss Walker, that's a serious allegation. Do you have any proof of this statement?" Elena didn't hesitate. She turned her gaze directly to Officer Reynolds, making sure everyone was watching. "No, because the body camera he was wearing conveniently malfunctioned. Isn't that right, Officer Reynolds?" The room fell into a charged silence. All eyes turned to Reynolds. The prosecutor cleared his throat, scrambling to steer the narrative back into his favor. "Miss Walker, you're a strong woman. Is it possible the officer felt threatened by your physical resistance?" Elena didn't blink. "I'm not stronger than a trained police officer, And let's be clear, I didn't resist until he violated my rights. The prosecutor opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Elena Walker added, I also didn't reach for his weapon, despite his claims. That was a fabrication to justify his use of force. The room seemed to freeze. Officer Reynolds shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. Finally, Judge Whitaker nodded. Very well, we'll reset for today. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. The gavel came down, and the room erupted into murmurs, whispers, speculation. Elena rose from the stand, her movements calm and deliberate. As she walked past Officer Reynolds, he avoided her gaze. He no longer looked smug. At the defense table, Nathan Cole leaned in, lowering his voice. Are you sure about this? He whispered, doubt creeping into his tone. Elena placed a steady hand on his arm, her grip firm. Trust me, Nathan, tomorrow, the truth will speak. Nathan's fingers hovered over his briefcase, filled not just with legal documents but with the weight of his responsibility to her. He hesitated, then said, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention, Elena, we need to talk. She turned slightly, her gaze calm yet unwavering. What's on your mind, Nathan? He exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the cool evening air, as they stepped outside the courthouse. You have to tell me what you're holding back. The judge knows it. The prosecutor knows it. And Reynolds, he's getting nervous. Whatever ace you're hiding, I need to know before we walk back into that courtroom. Later that evening, Elena stood in the doorway, waiting. The sharp suit from earlier was gone. She wore a simple navy sweatshirt and black leggings, a stark contrast to the poised appearance she had maintained throughout the day. Her hair was tied back, and her expression was unreadable. She stepped aside. Come in, she said. Nathan stepped inside, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Elena's living space was neat, almost minimalist, just the essentials. But amidst the simplicity, a few personal touches stood out. A framed photograph rested on a nearby shelf. In it, a younger Elena Walker, dressed in a navy uniform, her arm around an older man, in a matching uniform. Beside the frame, a folded American flag sat carefully placed. Then his gaze fell on a stack of neatly organized documents, discharge papers, commendations, training certifications. Nathan's fingers instinctively flipped through the pages, his eyes moving faster with each revelation. Wait, he muttered under his breath, his hands tightening around the documents. You were a Navy SEAL, Elena finished for him, Lieutenant Commander, retired. Nathan's breath caught. He stared at her, his mouth slightly open. Elena, this changes everything. Why didn't you tell me before? Because this isn't just about who I was, she said, her voice low but firm. It's about what Reynolds represents. This isn't just my fight, Nathan, it's about justice. She reached for the folded flag, turning it over in her hands, her fingers brushing against the fabric. We make them see me not as a defendant but as the woman who spent 20 years protecting the very freedoms that man tried to strip from me. Her voice was calm, but beneath it, something rumbled, a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. Nathan felt a chill roll down his spine. Not from fear, but from the sheer force of her resolve. Elena, he said softly, his grip tightening on the files. Tomorrow's going to be a fight. She placed the flag back on the shelf. I know, she said simply. The next morning, the courtroom was silent. The air was thick with unspoken tension. The only sound was the subtle tapping of Nathan's pen against the defense table. Are you ready for this? He asked in a low voice, glancing at her. Elena turned her head slightly, her expression steady, unreadable. I've been ready for years, Nathan, she exhaled slowly. Let's give them the truth. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the chamber. Judge Whitaker entered, his stern eyes sweeping across the room. Court is now in session. We will continue with the case of State versus Elena Walker. The prosecutor, a seasoned man with sharp features and a suit tailored to intimidate, stood. The battle was about to begin. The evidence unleashed. You stand by your account of her behavior? The prosecutor pressed. I do, Officer Reynolds replied, his eyes flicking toward Elena Walker for the briefest of moments. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied. Thank you, Officer Reynolds. No further questions. At the defense table, Nathan Cole rose slowly. His expression was unreadable, deliberate. He adjusted his tie, then strode toward the witness stand. Each step echoed through the silent courtroom. Officer Reynolds, Nathan began, his voice calm to calm. There was an edge to it, something sharp enough to make Reynolds shift slightly in his seat. You testified that. A murmur rippled through the room. Spectators leaned forward, almost as if they could will the evidence into existence. Judge Whitaker's gavel came down hard. Mr. Cole, the judge said, his voice sharp, if you have evidence, present it. Nathan didn't hesitate. He turned, walking back to the defense table, where he retrieved a USB drive. Your Honor, the defense submits video evidence recorded by a bystander during the arrest. The prosecutor shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense should have submitted this earlier. Sit down. Judge Whitaker interrupted, his tone lethal. Silence. A stunned, suffocating silence. And then chaos. The room exploded into frantic murmurs and hushed gasps. The very foundations of the prosecution's case had just been shaken to its core. Beside her, Nathan was pacing, his hands moving in erratic gestures as he muttered under his breath. This is huge, Elena. She didn't respond, just watching the courtroom unravel around her. That footage just tore his testimony apart, Nathan said, finally stopping to face her. Elena folded her hands neatly on the table, her gaze unwavering. It's a crack in the wall, Nathan. But walls don't fall with cracks alone. We need more. Nathan exhaled sharply, bracing his hands against the table. What's the next move? We've got the video. Elena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood. The room buzzed with renewed energy. Her steps were measured as she approached the witness stand. She didn't rush. She didn't falter. And as she sat, her posture was straight and yielding, a soldier at attention. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning, breaking the narrative. Miss Walker, Nathan Cole began, his tone steady. You've heard the accusations against your resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, attempting to seize a weapon. Are these accusations true? No, they are not, Elena replied firmly. She didn't hesitate, didn't blink. He shoved me against the patrol car and handcuffed me. Then he accused me of reaching for his weapon, which is a complete fabrication. A murmur spread through the gallery, but Elena wasn't finished. Her voice remained calm, but beneath it, something simmered. His actions weren't about law enforcement, she continued, her words deliberate, razor sharp. They were about control, about asserting power over someone he assumed couldn't fight back. Nathan paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the courtroom. Then he took a step closer. Miss Walker, there's been a lot of speculation about your background. Across the room, the prosecutor stiffened, his jaw clenched, his fingers curling into the edge of the table as if physically holding back his reaction. Nathan's voice rose, cutting through the charged silence. Ms. Walker, as a Navy SEAL, you were trained to handle high-pressure situations. Did you use any of that training during your encounter with Officer Reynolds? Elena didn't flinch. Yes, she said, her voice unwavering. I used it to stay calm, to de-escalate the situation, and to protect myself from harm without resorting to violence. Nathan let that sink in before delivering his final blow. And did you, at any point, attempt to harm Officer Reynolds or reach for his weapon? No, Elena answered. I did not. The silence that followed was heavy, unshakable. Every single person in that courtroom had just felt the ground shift beneath them. As Elena stepped down from the stand, the weight of her testimony lingered in the air. She returned to her seat, head held high, then leaned slightly toward Nathan. Now, she said softly, let's see how long that wall holds. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Cracks in the armor. Officer Daniel Reynolds sat at the plaintiff's table, his face pale, a sheen of sweat glistening under the harsh courtroom lights. The unshakable composure he had carried into the courtroom that morning, gone. His fingers clenched the edge of the table, the faint tremble in his hands betraying the fear seeping in. When he was called to the witness stand, he avoided looking at Elena Walker. She, however, didn't look away. Her gaze followed him with a calm intensity, as if dissecting every movement, every nervous twitch. When Reynolds finally sat down, his hand trembled as he adjusted the microphone, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the jury. Avery Langston, the prosecutor, approached, forcing a smile that barely masked his unease. Officer Reynolds, you've heard the defendant's testimony and her claims regarding your conduct. Do you have anything to say in response? Reynolds cleared his throat, his voice shaky but stubborn. Yes. Her account of the incident is exaggerated. I acted within my authority. Langston nodded, but his gaze flickered, sensing the weakness in his witness, and the claim that you used excessive force. Reynolds shifted in his seat. She was resisting. She was stronger than I anticipated. She made a sudden movement toward my side. I had to protect myself. Across the room, Nathan Cole shot to his feet. Your Honor, permission to cross-examine. Judge Whitaker nodded curtly. Granted. Nathan approached the stand slowly, his steps deliberate. He stopped just a few feet from Reynolds, his posture steady, his presence imposing without being overbearing. Then he let the silence stretch. Reynolds fidgeted under the weight of it. Nathan didn't blink, didn't break eye contact. He waited. Forced Reynolds to meet his gaze. Officer Reynolds, Nathan began, his tone calm but edged with steel. You testified that you felt threatened, that Miss Walker was stronger than you anticipated. But isn't it true that you had no real reason to believe she was a danger to you? Reynolds swallowed hard. She resisted. Resisted, or simply questioned your authority. Nathan interjected, his voice cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel. Reynolds hesitated, and in that pause everything shifted. Nathan pressed forward. The cracks in Reynolds' testimony were beginning to widen. The truth comes to light. Nathan's voice was unwavering, razor sharp. You accused a decorated Navy SEAL woman who has served this country with honor of being a threat. Tell me, does it embarrass you to know that the person you tried to intimidate has faced dangers you couldn't begin to imagine? Officer Daniel Reynolds flinched. His composure already fraying at the edges slipped even further. That's irrelevant. It's completely relevant. Nathan cut in, his voice sharp, unrelenting. Because this case isn't about resisting arrest, it's about abuse of power. Reynolds looked like a man standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. The air in the room shifted, thick with unspoken tension. The jury exchanged glances, unease flickering in their expressions. Even Judge Whitaker, usually detached and stoic, leaned forward slightly, as if sensing the balance of power shifting. At the defense table, Elena Walker sat motionless. Her calm presence had become commanding, a quiet strength that filled the room, unshaken, unyielding. Nathan turned to the jury, his voice measured but cutting. What you've heard in this courtroom over the past few days is a tale of two stories. Officer Reynolds would have you believe that my client, a woman with no criminal record, a woman who has dedicated her life to serving her country, suddenly became violent and aggressive for no reason. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Then he moved in for the kill. But the truth is far simpler and far more troubling. He reached for a file, flipping it open with careful precision. Then, he pulled out a stack of documents. This, he said, holding up the first page, is Officer Reynolds' personnel record. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Nathan let the reaction settle, then turned to Elena. And now it's time for her to speak her truth. Elena rose slowly. Her movements were measured, controlled, deliberate. As she walked to the front of the courtroom, she didn't just take up space, she commanded it. Then, standing tall, she turned to the jury. My name is Lieutenant Commander Elena Walker, she began, her voice clear, steady. For 20 years, I served in the United States Navy as a SEAL. I've been to places most people can't imagine. Faced dangers most people will never know. The verdict looms. The jury watched Elena Walker, their expressions a mixture of awe and anger, not at her, but at the system that had allowed this to happen. Elena turned back to the judge, her voice steady, unwavering. Your Honor, I fought for this country, I fought for justice, and I'm here today to fight not just for myself, but for every person who has ever been wronged by those sworn to protect them. The room erupted into applause. Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel repeatedly. Order, he barked, but even he couldn't quite hide the flicker of respect in his eyes. At the prosecution's table, Avery Langston turned back to the jury, his tone measured but for the first time, uncertain. Officer Reynolds is a man with a questionable record. Yes, Avery admitted. He hesitated. That alone spoke volumes, but law enforcement officers make split-second decisions every day, often under difficult circumstances. Officer Reynolds believed he was acting in the best interest of public safety. He paused, glancing toward Reynolds, whose face was ashen, his once confident demeanor now reduced to a mask of unease. Mistakes may have been made, Avery conceded, but that does not change the fact that Officer Reynolds was doing his job. The words hung in the air, but they didn't land. Because the room wasn't buying it. Across the courtroom, Nathan Cole took a step forward. This isn't about a mistake, he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. It's about a questioner, simple, reasonable question. And for that Elena Walker was thrown against a car, handcuffed, and humiliated. His voice rose, passion igniting every word. This isn't just about Elena Walker. He turned, looking each juror in the eye. It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who wear a badge and swear an oath to protect and serve are held to the highest standards of integrity. Because when they fail to do so, the entire system fails. Nathan took a step closer to the jury, lowering his voice but somehow making it even more powerful. Asterisk asterisk today, you have a choice. A choice to stand for truth, for justice, and for accountability. Elena Walker didn't just fight for herself, she fought for every person who has ever been silenced by those in power. The verdict. The courtroom was packed, the tension thick enough to suffocate as the jury filed back in. At the defense table, Elena Walker stood beside Nathan Cole, her face an unreadable mask. Across the room, Officer Daniel Reynolds sat stiffly, his eyes locked on the jury box. His fingers clenched the table so tightly his knuckles had turned bone white. At the front of the courtroom, the jury four persona, middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a serious expression stood as Judge Whitaker addressed her. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, she replied, her voice steady. The judge nodded. Please read the verdict. The four-person unfolded the slip of paper. The entire room held its breath. We, the jury, find the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Elena Walker. She paused, her gaze unwavering. Not guilty on all charges. For a moment, the courtroom was silent as, if the weight of those words needed time to settle. Then the floodgates broke. Gasps, murmurs, and then, applause rippled through the gallery, growing louder, unstoppable. Elena closed her eyes for just a second, exhaled, slow, steady. Beside her, Nathan allowed himself a small smile, a flicker of pride, admiration. Across the room, Daniel Reynolds sat frozen, his once uncheckable confidence gone, his face drained of color, his entire world shattered in an instant. Judge Whitaker's gavel struck a demand for order, but the energy in the courtroom, undeniable. Elena Walker didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. She simply let her gaze sweep across the room, taking in the weight of the moment. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away, leaving behind the cameras, the reporters, the chaos, because the truth had already spoken, and it was louder than any headline ever could be. Months later, Officer Daniel Reynolds was dismissed from the police force. The man who once stood untouchable now faced criminal charges for perjury and misconduct. And the officers who once stood by him, gone. They distanced themselves, unwilling to defend the indefensible. But Elena Walker never sought revenge. She never needed to, because justice had spoken, and she wasn't done fighting.